Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. During the last two seminar recordings, as you'll remember, I sat down with a group of men and they asked me various questions on sex, man-woman relationships, and assorted subjects. And we had such a good time during those two sessions that I thought it would be very interesting and more personally pleasurable to me to sit down with 6 women and invite them to ask any questions they would like to on the same subjects of sex, man-woman relationships, marriage, and the problems that can arise in these contexts. So, tonight, I have with me, in the library of my home, 6 beautiful girls. I'm in heaven, and we're going to talk about sex. And as my wife is also present, talking is all we'll be doing, but I'm hoping we'll be able to make it interesting. Okay, let's begin.
Do you believe that human beings would naturally develop to be bisexual if it weren't for cultural and social taboos?
No, I do not. I'm aware that a number of people today are advancing the notion that human beings are, quote, naturally bisexual, unquote, and that only cultural taboos prevent this fact from being evident. But I think clearly this is mistaken. To begin with, if we look at the animal world under man, we see that while occasionally homosexual activity does take place, overwhelmingly animals are heterosexual. That, to begin with, is a biological fact. Throughout the entire living world, animals who copulate are, in the overwhelming preponderance of instances, heterosexual. Too much has been made of the occasional acts of homosexuality that do among certain animals. Certain zoologists and biologists have questioned rather seriously, and I think with justification, whether or not the acts that we sometimes describe as homosexual between animals in fact have the same or similar significance as homosexual acts taking place between humans. But in any event, what is not debatable is that the dominant, the overwhelmingly statistically prevalent trend in the animal world is heterosexual. That's the first observation. The second observation is that if we look in terms of the way men and women are built, biologically built, anatomically, without talking about nature having, quote, purposes in any mystical sense, I think there is a valid teleological sense in which we can say that men and women are designed by nature, or more precisely have evolved toward a heterosexual kind of relationship. However, I would add this qualification. I would say that in the absence of purely cultural and historical taboos and restrictions, there are circumstances under which homosexual acts would occur among people that don't occur now and that would not be describable as neurotic. To begin with, people would be much freer than most people are today to express feelings of love, tenderness, and even physical affection for members of their own sex, for whom they have deep feelings. People would be much freer than they are today, not only to verbally express feelings of love or affection or tenderness for members of the same sex, but to express it in a more physical way. In our culture, for example, on a relative scale, women are freer today to hug and kiss each other than men are. Now that's purely cultural. In Europe, for example, men are much freer than are Americans about expressing physical affection for each other, and I think that's desirable, and I think there'd be much more of that. Now, I also think that in situations where there was complete deprivation for the opposite sex, where people didn't have access to the opposite sex, in situations of extreme social isolation, people could normally turn for physical or sensual gratification, or at any rate some people sometimes would, to members of their own sex, and I would not describe that as neurotic or perverted or pathological. But I still believe that the dominant inclination, the dominant desire of people, if all possible choices and options are open to them, would be in a heterosexual direction. I am very interested in this problem, not only because I'm now engaged in doing a book on man-woman relationships, but because today there is so much questioning of our many conventional and historically rooted notions about what is normal or not normal in man-woman relationships. And I'm struck by the fact that in my own practice as a therapist, the techniques and investigatory processes that we use do reveal significant underlying psychological problems present where we have homosexuality or bisexuality. But I have read and been told many times, and it has been argued, possibly with some validity, that a psychotherapist, after all, sees only a bias sample. He sees people who are self-admittedly unhappy and disturbed and seeking to change, but that he doesn't come into contact with the many homosexuals and bisexuals who are allegedly happy, normal, well-adjusted, and so forth. And I have been thinking for some time of a project I would like to undertake, if you wish, of a research kind. I would like to meet with a group of self-descriptively normal bisexuals or so-called normal homosexuals who are not in therapy and who don't want therapy and who profess to be completely contented with their present sexual inclinations. And I would love to do a 4 or 5 hour exploratory session where I would really ask them, would they be willing to work with the techniques and experiments that I use in the course of group therapy for the purpose of seeing what came out. Would their answers and responses fall into the same pattern that I have encountered among homosexuals and bisexuals in therapy, where underlying pathology, if you want to use that word, is very clearly present? Or would their answers be significantly different? I think that could be very, very interesting and significant in offering additional scientific support for the position that I'm taking. Yes?
During a lengthy separation of a couple, is absolute sexual fidelity a realistic and psychologically healthy goal?
I don't think that anyone can give a yes or no answer to that question. I think this is an issue that people have to decide on their own. I think that when people are subject to long separations, most of the time, I will say this, most of the time, it is unreasonable to impose a demand of complete physical fidelity. If by that you mean no sexual transactions with any other person. I think when people are separated for a long period, to begin with, in the majority of cases, they probably do, in fact, have other relationships. I don't think that one can condemn this as, quote, unhealthy, necessarily. I think people have to know themselves. They have to know what they want out of life. Now, it's possible that some people will have a relationship such that even though there is a long separation, no other partner is acceptable to them, even though they endure considerable frustration. And they may choose and decide that no other partner is acceptable, and that's the way they want it, and fine and good. Another couple may say, across a long period of time, that would not be handleable by us. We would like to have the option of other relationships. I think the mistake that many people make when they get into this subject, and I have a suspicion I'll be making this point again before the evening is through, is a tendency to demand rules of a kind that cannot exist. You know, when you embark on a career, you don't expect or demand that somebody will give you an ironclad set of rules that will cover every conceivable problem, obstacle, difficulty, or crisis that you might encounter in the course of a career across 20 or 30 years, such that if you just follow rules A, B, and C, everything will be swell at the end. Everybody realizes that life is so complex and so many different things, unexpected things can happen, that it's very hard to make ironclad rules to tell you exactly what to do in all possible situations. When it comes to love, marriage, and man-woman relationships, there's a great tendency for people to want rules.